Ever heard of surgeons hitting the pause button right in the middle of an operation? You know, when it's really life or death.
Yeah, talk about a high-stakes situation.
Well, today we're diving into a procedure called damage control laparotomy.
Definitely one of those procedures where every second counts.
And get this, the term damage control actually comes from the Navy.
Really?
Yep, imagine having to patch up a battleship in the middle of a battle. It's kind of the idea here.
Wow. So it's about doing what you have to do to stay afloat and then heading back to port for the full repair later.
Exactly, because sometimes in surgery, trying to fix everything perfectly right away, especially when the patient is really unstable, it can actually do more harm than good.
Makes sense. So you need to know when to prioritize that immediate stabilization over a complete fix.
Right. But what kind of situations would call for this kind of dramatic move in the first place?
Well, think major trauma, like a car accident, or situations with massive blood loss where the body is really in crisis mode.
Okay, so we're talking intense situations here.
Absolutely, and that's where the deadly triad comes into play.
Deadly triad. Okay, now you've got me hooked.
So picture this. You have hypothermia,
Yeah.
the body's core temperature plummets, and that throws off all kinds of vital functions.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about being cold, it's about your whole system going haywire.
Exactly. Then you've got acidosis. This is where the blood actually becomes acidic because oxygen isn't getting where it needs to go.
Okay, that sounds bad.
It is. And then, to make matters even worse, you have coagulopathy. That basically means the blood's ability to clot goes out the window.
So you're dealing with a patient who's freezing, their blood is turning acidic, and it won't clot.
You got it. And each of those conditions on its own is dangerous. But together, they create this domino effect that can completely spiral out of control, especially during surgery.
And that's where this damage control laparotomy comes in, to break that chain reaction.
Precisely. Think of it as a strategic pause, a way to buy time to address those immediate life-threatening problems.
So the surgeons are essentially buying time. What do they actually do during this pause?
So they'll control any active bleeding, they'll limit contamination from any injuries, and here's the surprising part. They often actually pack the abdomen with sterile materials to control the bleeding.
Wait, they pack it like a suitcase.
It sounds strange, right?
Yeah.
But it's really effective for applying direct pressure and stemming the bleeding until the patient is stable enough to handle more complex repairs.
So it's about knowing when to hold back to let the body do some of the work itself.
Exactly.
Now, I know our source material breaks down this whole procedure into 5 distinct phases.
It does.
But what I find most fascinating is that it's not just about what happens in the OR. It's like this whole relay race against time.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, it really is.
So before we follow this patient's journey, I'm kind of curious, how did surgeons handle these really catastrophic cases in the past, before this procedure was so well defined?
Well, for a long time, the thinking was to fix everything in that first surgery,
What?
no matter how unstable the patient was.
Really?
Yeah, but you can imagine operating on someone who's like a ticking time bomb. They're hypothermic, their blood's acidic, it's not clotting.
Right.
Trying to do too much at once, it often ended badly.
That makes sense. It's like, trying to build a house on a foundation that's crumbling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And our source actually mentions how early attempts at damage control, particularly during the World Wars, they often involved packing the abdomen to control bleeding.
Okay.
But then they would leave those packs in place for days.
Oh, wow.
Can you imagine the risk of infection?
Yikes, yeah. Talk about a ticking time bomb.
Right.
So when did this shift to a more controlled, staged approach? When did that start to happen?
Well, there were pioneers, even back in the early 20th century.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Our source actually mentions a Dr. Pringle in 1908. He described a technique for controlling bleeding from the liver
1908.
using compression.
That's incredible. Over a century ago.
Yeah.
And they were already thinking about these kinds of techniques.
It's amazing how some ideas, even revolutionary ones, can take decades to be, fully appreciated
Right.
and integrated into practice. But Dr. Pringle's method, that was essentially a form of damage control.
Interesting.
Even if they didn't call it that at the time, it was
Yeah.
about buying time.
So over the years, they started to put the pieces together.
Exactly.
It wasn't just about stopping the bleeding, but also managing all these other deadly factors.
Their source highlights some key studies from the 70s and 80s that really solidify these principles of damage control laparotomy as we know it today.
Okay.
A 1978 study, for example, found that survival rates for liver injuries, they skyrocketed when they used a damage control approach with a planned second operation.
So it was a two-part approach from the beginning. Get in, stabilize, and live to fight another day.
Exactly. The idea of, truncating that initial surgery, make it as short as possible, just focus on controlling the bleeding and contamination that really gained traction in the 80s.
Okay.
Get in, achieve those goals, get out.
Like a surgical pit stop.
I like that analogy.
I like that.
And then once the patient is stable, the surgeons can go back in and really address those injuries more thoroughly.
So it was a totally different way of thinking at the time.
It was a radical shift,
Right.
but it's one that's undoubtedly saved countless lives.
It's kind of amazing how what seems counterintuitive, like hitting the pause button in the middle of this really critical situation, is actually the smartest approach.
Yeah.
Speaking of counterintuitive, you mentioned earlier that surgeons try to avoid using suction during a damage control laparotomy.
Right?
Now, that just seems strange to me.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they want to clear away all that blood and fluid?
It seems counterproductive, but when you use suction, especially in a patient who's bleeding heavily and their blood isn't clotting properly,
Right.
you risk dislodging any clots that are forming naturally.
So it's about preserving those clots even if they're really fragile.
Exactly. It's about working with the body's natural defenses, not against them.
Fascinating.
And our source even mentions how surgeons will often manually remove blood and clots to avoid disrupting that process of hemostasis.
Wow. It's amazing how much thought goes into every single step of this.
It is.
Every decision. It's clearly so much more than just, cutting and stitching.
Absolutely. And that careful consideration, it extends far beyond the operating room.
Right. Because as we said, this is a relay race.
Yeah,
The next leg of the race is in the ICU.
exactly.
So we're essentially picking back up with this patient in the ICU, and it sounds like things are still pretty touch and go.
Oh, yeah, the ICU becomes the next big challenge.
Right, because even though they've controlled the immediate bleeding, the patient's still in a very vulnerable state.
They are. Remember we talked about that deadly triad?
Oh, right.
It's still a huge threat.
Right, the hypothermia, acidosis, and the blood not clotting, those don't just magically go away after surgery.
Well,
So what's the plan in the ICU? How do they actually address each of those things?
it's a multi-pronged approach, for sure.
Okay.
Really carefully orchestrated. Oh, but so first off, they continue the aggressive warming that they started back in the OR.
Okay.
So we're talking like warm blankets, heated fluids. Sometimes they even have like warmed air circulating around the patient.
Wow. So it's literally like a high-tech incubator.
Exactly.
Just trying to bring that body temperature back up to a safe level.
Yeah, and because that hypothermia really messes with the body's ability to clot,
Right.
they're working at the same time to correct that.
Okay.
So they might do things like transfusions of blood products, fresh frozen plasma, platelets, to help replenish those clotting factors.
So they're kind of like giving the body a jump start.
Exactly.
And what about that acidosis, that acidic blood?
Right, so that's where things like careful fluid management come in and medications.
Okay.
They might use things like sodium bicarbonate
Yeah.
to try to neutralize some of that acidity.
Interesting.
It's a real balancing act.
Yeah, I bet.
Constantly monitoring the blood chemistry, making all these tiny adjustments to keep everything in that, safe zone.
It sounds so intense. It's just this constant vigilance.
It is.
This like back and forth to make sure the patient's stable.
Yeah, and while the ICU team is focused on stabilizing the patient, the surgeons haven't gone home.
Oh, right?
They're constantly evaluating, watching for any signs of new bleeding,
Okay.
other complications, because they have to think about that next surgery.
That second surgery, the more definitive repair.
Exactly. And timing that second operation, that's one of the most crucial decisions in this whole process.
Because I imagine do it too soon and the patient might not be strong enough,
Exactly.
but wait too long and the risks increase.
It's
So
okay.
how do they find that balance?
There's no magic formula.
Right.
It really comes down to carefully weighing the patient's overall stability
Okay.
against those potential risks of delaying the repairs.
Right.
But our source does mention a general time frame.
Okay.
Ideally, they'd like to do that second surgery within 72 hours of the first one.
72 hours. That's not a lot of time.
It's not.
Hmm.
And the source actually says going beyond that 72-hour window,
Yeah,
that really increases the risk of things like infection.
that makes sense.
So it's this incredible balancing act,
It really is.
making sure the patient can handle that longer, more complex surgery,
Right.
but not waiting so long that they become more vulnerable to other problems.
This whole deep dive has been fascinating.
Yeah,
It really highlights how much goes into being a trauma surgeon.
it really does.
It's incredible, all the decisions, the skill, the intuition,
Absolutely.
and, the courage
That's a
to do
deal.
this day in and day out.
Yeah, it's a field where you're constantly making these really high stakes decisions.
Right,
And sometimes knowing when to act and when to kind of hold back,
right.
that can make all the difference.
And that actually reminds me of that idea from our source material about applying this damage control way of thinking to other areas of life, too.
Oh, interesting.
Right, because we might not be trauma surgeons,
Right.
but we all face situations that feel overwhelming,
Definitely.
where our gut instinct is to just try to fix it all immediately.
Yeah.
But sometimes, maybe that's not the best approach.
Sometimes it's better to take a step back,
Right.
assess the situation, and figure out what you can control in that moment.
It's like that saying, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging.
Exactly. Sometimes the best thing you can do is pause, give yourself a chance to regroup, and then you can start thinking about that plan to move forward.
I love that. So listeners, as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of damage control laparotomy, we'll leave you with this. Where in your own life could you maybe benefit from hitting that pause button? Where could a little bit of strategic retreat actually help you move forward more effectively? Until next time, thanks for listening.